Yahoo! Out there in Big Bear Connected Land. How are y'all doing today? Oh my goodness gracious. It is now Friday at 1 p.m. and it is July 24th. I can't even wrap my purple hair around my brain on that one. I think we only have one more week of summer before our kiddos even go back to school. Now they will be going back distance learning, but that's okay because once everything settles down, we're going to get those kiddos back in school where they can see their friends and their teachers and get learning again. So y'all, I think you should spend this last week of your summer break reading. So I just want to say, we're here with Sooz, with Sooz, that's me. And today I am so excited because we have an author, a local author, who's going to share some of her writings with us today. So I'm just going to turn it over to our beautiful Ms. Amber Parle. Amber, how are you doing today?
Hi, I'm doing great. How are you today?
I am hunky-dory. Yes, I am. Now, I'd like to find out a little bit about you, and I'm sure Big Bear Connected Land would as well. Now, are you from Big Bear? Where have you been? Tell us what you've been doing.
So I am sort of from Big Bear. I moved to Big Bear with my mom when I was 10 years old and grew up in Big Bear, went through the whole school system, graduated from Big Bear High School, and then went off to university at UC Davis. And after that, I spent several years just on and off traveling the world and recently got back from New Zealand. So just love to travel, love to write, love to hike.
Traveling the world, I bet that helps you as a writer. Where all have you been?
Oh my gosh. So I first left the US and went to South Korea for a year. I visited Thailand for a bit. Then I went backpacking in South America to Peru, Bolivia, Chile, and Colombia. Then I went to Europe and backpacked through Italy, Switzerland, Ireland, Scotland, and the Czech Republic. And then I went to acting school in London for 3 months. And then I went then I drove around the US and went to Canada. And then I went back to South America, visited Central America first, Costa Rica, Panama, back to Colombia, and then lived in Australia for a year, and then went to New Zealand. And now I'm back here.
I am exhausted from listening to all that. My goodness gracious, bless your heart. You have been a very busy lady, and I can only imagine the experiences that you have acquired that you can share as a writer. But now today, I understand you're going to share from your novel. So you want to share a little bit about that with us? What is it called?
Yeah, so it's the first novel that I've written, and it's called Zilika. And I actually started writing it when I was like 17 years old, and it completely evolved into something different than I expected it to be. And I plan to write, it's now planned to be part of a trilogy. Originally, when I started, it was going to be a standalone novel, but just too much happened in it, and now it's going to be part of a trilogy.
That's so exciting that it's still growing. And so today you're going to share from it. You want to go ahead and get started? Now, before she does that, Big Bear Connected, y'all know the drill if you've been here before, and if you haven't, we're all going to settle down, stop what we're doing out there, sit in your comfy little chair, kick off your shoes, lean back. Now, don't go to sleep, though. I know it's snooze with Sooz, but I just want you to relax, breathe in, and open up your minds and your imagination to Miss Amber Parle. Take it away, Amber.
Thanks, Suze. So just before I start, I deal with a lot of heavy topics in my novel, and the beginning is a little bit dark, so I'm actually going to skip the first scene and kind of go into the second scene, so that way it's a bit more relatable to some of our readers and a bit more PG. So hope you enjoy. Frozen droplets of sweat covered Aurora's body, and tears flooded her eyes as she choked back a sob. They had come for her in the dream. Rough-spun hoods concealed their features as their calloused hands dug into her flesh. They dragged her into a room of damp stone where dead things hung from the walls and stains of past horrors consumed the floor. Chains were fastened around her ankles and wrists. She tried to scream, but the sound was trapped in her throat. One of the men approached. He pulled her head back, forcing her to look at him. He laughed as he removed the hood to reveal the face of the Duke. I told you I would have you. And then she woke up. Aurora rubbed her hands over her body as she tried to wipe the filth of the nightmare away. That's all it was. A horrid dream and nothing more. The tremors subsided as her breathing returned to normal, and the tears on her cheeks dried to salt crystals. It was dark in the crate, though her eyes had adjusted to fragmented light of the oiled lamps. It seeped through the slits enough for her to make out the small pile of matted hay. The light was inconsistent at best, but it was an improvement to the absolute darkness of the previous night. Peering through the cracks, she began to gather what existed beyond the walls of her prison. To her back, the flat surface of the ship's hull closed in on her. Crates occupied the spaces to either side, so close she could touch them through the larger slits. In front, there appeared to be another row, segregated from her by a walkway that extended into darkness in either direction. It was impossible to tell, but Aurora was fairly certain most of the hold was full of prison cells. She leaned her head back and exhaled deeply in an attempt to ignore an angry moan emanating from her stomach. The last food she had eaten was at the wedding. How long ago had that been? A day? 2 days? It could not have been more than 3. She imagined it was the morning after the wedding, 7:30, and time for breakfast. Hartworth breakfasts were bland occasions with minimal chatter and regular yawns, but that day breakfast would be far from normal. Scarlet would come to wake Aurora during her morning rounds of the manor, only to discover the bed untouched. In fact, it would be in the exact state she had left it the previous evening, sheets turned down and waiting for their mistress. The maid would assume Aurora had fallen asleep by the fire in the library, sprawled across the chaise, book in hand, as she often did. When the chair proved vacant, Scarlet would then return to Aurora's room to be certain she had not overlooked the girl snoozing on the window seat. There would be no avoiding it after that, and timidly she would approach Lady Hartworth, who took her breakfast in bed, to alert her that Aurora was missing. Rather than believe the maid, her mother would dismiss the woman, insisting she was mistaken. Hidden amongst the frills and lace of her pillows, Lady Hartworth would proclaim. Scarlet would be instructed to look again, only to return minutes later with the same conclusion, in turn sparking Lady Hartworth's indignation, and after a few curt comments concerning the maid's incompetence, she would go to the room herself. Upon examining the empty bed, she would demand if Scarlet had searched the library. Scarlet would confirm that she had considered every imaginable place, at which point Lady Hartworth would gather the remainder of the servants, including their poor butler, Gerald, and have them comb the manor, stables, and gardens. Only when they discovered no trace of Miss Aurora would Lord Hartworth, who took his breakfast alone in his study, be alerted. By then it would be 9:15, and since Aurora's engagement with the Duke was at 10, Lord Hartworth's priority would be to send an urgent apology, stating that his daughter had come under a sudden illness, the cold air at the wedding, and would be forced to postpone their interview until the following day. Lord Hartworth was fully aware of his daughter's distaste for the gentleman, and would assume she had fled the manor. Her safety would be an afterthought, not considered until several weeks had elapsed without word of her whereabouts. Had I reached the country, I would have written them, not of my location to be certain, but that I was alive and well. Shannon would call later, assuming something had gone amiss and Aurora had been discovered during her flight. Lord Hartworth's fuming and Lady Hartworth's distress would only increase Shannon's anxiety. Would she confess their plan, or hold back in the hope that Aurora had merely been delayed? All of these thoughts flashed by in a moment, and then when the moment was gone, Aurora's attention returned to her hunger and captivity. She tried counting the cracks in the wood, but the task proved too tedious and dull even to pass the time. Then she picked at the straw bedding, but stopped upon realizing it only disturbed the fleas. Another growl erupted from her stomach. The movement of the ship was smooth and steady, like her Nan's rocking chair. As the moments hobbled by, she absorbed the sounds, tiny creaks and pops, the groan of the wood, rat claws scraping against the planks. They created an organic melody, much like an orchestra tuning its instruments before an opera. She found herself humming softly, and after a time she began to doze. Won't you keep going? 'Twas helping to calm me. Aurora started so horribly that her head crashed into the top of the crate. She bit her tongue against several unladylike exclamations and rubbed the large bump that was already forming. "You all right? Bit tight in these cages, eh?" The sound was close, opposite of the girl who had broke the Earth's heart. She must have been returned sometime in the night. Aurora could hear the girl breathing softly in her sleep. "Ain't you got nothing to say? I ain't a bloody pirate if that's what you're thinking. What's your name, love?" The accent was one she had heard before, though not one she encountered in her regular circles. It belonged to the lower class of Salzen. Western Salzen, perhaps? She had glimpsed her captors only once when they threw her into the crate, and even by the dim light she had noticed their pale, almost white skin. But she had not heard them speak. How could she be certain if this was a friend? It could be one of them, trying to lull her into a false sense of security. But her better reason did not think so. There was something about his voice that made her feel safe. Trusting her instincts, she gave him her name, Aurora. It was barely a whisper. "Eh? My name is Aurora." She had always hated her name. "Eh? You ain't common. I can tell from your accent. How'd you get yourself in this mess, eh?" Aurora's nerves tickled her spine. If her captors discovered she was of good breeding, would that fare worse or better for her? Maybe I should disguise my voice. "And how is it that ye come to think that I isn't common, eh?" The boy broke into a hearty laugh that carried out into the hold of the ship. "Ah, shut it!" a raspy voice shouted from the darkness. The boy continued to giggle, though considerably quieter than before. "Trying to talk like me ain't going to do you no good. You've been living with the wealth for too long." He was not mistaken. Aurora blushed. The idea was flawed to begin with. She scarce had any contact with the lower class, except when her mother was in a generous mood and hosted a charity. Those occasions were rare, and often Lady Hartworth had the servants deliver the donations. "So answer me question. How'd you get here?" "I find myself at a loss as how I happened upon these most unfortunate circumstances." There was a long silence, and Aurora began to wonder if the boy did not comprehend her, until at last he spoke. "The Deshanty ain't been to your part of town for years." "Yes. However, I was not in my part of town, now was I?" Everyone in eastern Salzen heard tales of the Deshanty pirates. They came in the wee hours of the night and prowled the streets of the western slums, looking for abandoned or unprotected children to take back to their hulls. A few months later, the prisoners were sold into slavery in the deserts of the Kritsen. Sometimes officials would discover the ships before they departed, free the children, and imprison the scoundrels who took them. This was rare, for most Deshanty ships also traded precious merchandise from the north, and officials were easily swayed by the lure of red gold, yellow sapphires, and black pearls. Despite the significant increase in missing children over the years, the danger had remained near the docks and surrounding slums. Eastern Salzen youth were immune, until Aurora. The journey to Shannon's fringed upon Western Salzen, and would have been the surest way to avoid being recognized. Aurora had been focused on her solace in the country and escaping a loathsome marriage to the Duke. The Deshanty had been the farthest thing from her mind. How I came here is of little consequence, thus I do not see the logic in discussing it. Course it ain't. But we ain't going nowheres, so you might as well tell it, Noe. Aurora was unaccustomed to being demanded to do anything, especially by those of lower social strata. Surprisingly, she found it quite refreshing. Through their imprisonment, they had become equals, she and this boy. So for the time being, she could throw decorum out the window. "What reason is there for me to trust you with my story?" "Don't you mean what reason ain't there?" His response made Aurora smile. Not only was it true, but it was very much something Wesley would have said. "Very well then, but I should like to know with whom I am conversing. The name's Colin Finney." Aurora pictured him sticking out a rough-skinned hand stained with dirt, and in her imagination she shook it. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Finney." "The leisure 'tis mine, my lady." Aurora attempted to reposition herself, for the story was long, and she wished to be as comfortable as possible. Ideally, she would lay on her stomach, propped on her elbows, but her prison proved insufficient for the task, so she would have to make do with sitting on her back, with her back against the wall and legs outstretched in front. Even that was barely manageable. "Well, Mr. Finney," she began, I happened to be running away. What was you running away from? Pins and needles stabbed her legs as they regained consciousness. The story is tediously long, however I am willing to recount an abridged version, should it better suit you. From what I hear, the Ashanti voyages take a good part of a year. Now get on with it. Should I keep going, or do you want me to stop there?
No, please. I'm fascinated. Keep going.
Okay. Chapter 2. The reading parlor lay still on that cheerful May morning. From its window one could look out upon tended lawns and flower squares full of poppies tilting their faces to welcome the day. Light smells of honeysuckle glided through the air like a mature leaf in a fall breeze, and birds flitted through the swaying willow branches to bathe in the porcelain baths scattered throughout the rose garden. In the distance, as the first sun crept over the rolling hills, Salzen City began to unlock its doors. Thistle Avenue was laden with aromas of fresh-baked rolls, blueberry crisp tarts, cream pastries, and chocolate muffins, so rich they could be tasted on the air. Bells jingled from the door fronts on Juniper Street as servants hustled about the luxurious millineries, boutiques, and haberdasheries, collecting their employers' latest purchases. Grayson Square was packed with bustling crowds eager to claim the freshest meats, fish, and produce. There was salmon from the southern seas, crabs and lobsters from the northern coast, and trout fished from the Yorkshire and Pembrokeshire rivers. On the other side of the square, farmers displayed their bounty. Apples and pears were in season, but there were also melons, cabbages, turnips, potatoes, carrots, asparagus, onions, and eggplant, among other vegetables. Then there were the cheese stalls, honey and jam sellers, and the butcher shop in the northern corner. Carriages poured from the side streets, the clomp of hooves echoing across the stone buildings as horses trotted beneath balconies overgrown with vines. It was difficult to believe that minutes before the town had been quieter than an empty church. It was the 232nd year of the Fourth Age, and most would claim it a good year. Prosperity was flowing throughout Salzen, and there was minimal discord in the Senate. King Henry had just celebrated his 56th birthday. He was in excellent health, complacent disposition, and was in all respects a king of the people, putting duty to country before all else. During his reign he had achieved what no king before had, a lasting peace with Avonsil. The country across the sea had been in contention with Salzen for centuries before King Henry ascended the throne and established a truce with King Silman of Avonsil. Back in the quiet room overlooking the tended lawn, the hours crept by unnoticed. The clock on the mantel merrily chimed the hour, with no one but the bookshelves and paintings to hear. The sun's rays passed through the spotless windows, sweeping over the neatly stacked books, and past the neglected armchairs to dance in the crystal pendants hanging from the oil lamps, to paint rainbows on the back wall. When the day was nearly spent, and the last rays of the second sun had all but vanished, Aurora entered, closing the door quietly behind her. After lighting one of the smaller oil lamps, she made for the cozy blue seat nestled in the alcove of the window. A proper lady would sit neatly, with straight back and feet grounded on the floor. But there was no one to see, so she slipped off her shoes, pulled her feet up underneath her, and leaned back against the abundant frilled pillows that decorated the seat. Once she was perfectly situated, she opened the leather-skin book she had begun the previous evening. Half a paragraph later, she was completely immersed in the provocative novel, A Sea Apart, written by a young revolutionary during the Third War with Avonsil. Though it was a monstrous tome, she could scarce put it down for more than a few hours, and was almost finished. A deep sigh found its way from her heart to her lips as she contemplated the circumstances of the main character, a handsome and chivalrous sailor who traveled from port to port, courting ladies, fighting duels, and stirring up mischief. Through the course of his journey, the man had come to love two women, both daughters of rulers from different lands, Salzen and Avonsil. The sailor had discovered the woman from Avonsil was heavy with his child, and her father demanded their marriage and the abandonment of the man's piratical ways. A priest was called, and just as they were about to say their vows, a messenger burst into the room with news that the Salzen lass had given birth to a healthy son. His son. It was an impossible choice, but a choice had to be made. How nice it must be to have a choice. As circumstance had intended, Aurora was born to privilege, which was accompanied by obligation. Eventually she would be prevailed upon to marry, and quite possibly through an arranged engagement. But for years she had banished the notion and lived carefree, believing, hoping, that some day the custom would disappear or fall out of fashion. Aurora would hardly admit to it, but the sands of the hourglass were quickly slipping away. A week prior, her sister Jocelyn had been inclined to become engaged to Sir Richard Wallace Kensington. Their parents were quite pleased. He was the younger of two sons, with an income that matched their own, and would only increase as he pursued a position as a politician. What truly mattered, in Aurora's opinion, was how Jocelyn felt. And in Jocelyn's eyes, Sir Kensington was a knight with armor that shone brighter than all the jewels in the king's crown. He will make her happy, I'm certain of it. Begging your pardon, Miss Hartworth. Scarlett's voice made Aurora jump so violently that a sea apart leapt from her lap. Scarlett rushed to collect the book and curtsied as she handed it back to Aurora. Forgive me, but your sister's fiancé has arrived, and dinner will be served in the quarter hour. Very well, thank you, Scarlett. Aurora dipped her head to dismiss the young maid, who had recently entered her family service. Although Lady Hartworth thought Scarlett incompetent, Aurora was often amused by the maid's fidgety demeanor and overindulgence in bows and curtsies. She flipped through the pages to calculate how many remained before the next chapter, and noticed a few were stained with greasy fingerprints and what might have been spilled tea. Curt. There were several things her brother valued, but maintaining the quality of a book was not one of them. To Aurora's dismay, she would be unable to reach the end of the chapter before dinner. Using a dried flower to mark her progress, she closed the book, straightened her dress, and leisurely made her way toward her bedroom. There were 2 rooms set aside for meals at the manor, one casual and the other formal. As they were entertaining that evening, it would be... Sorry, let me start over that paragraph. There were 2 rooms set aside for meals at the manor, one casual and the other formal. As they were entertaining that evening, they would be utilizing the larger, with the grand auburn-stained oak table that filled the center of the cathedral ceiling chamber. 10 chairs were evenly spaced around the table, their backs carved with the likeness of a lion, and their cream cushions embroidered with silver and wine roses. The walls were adorned with rich tapestries depicting historic battles and figureheads, except for the one overlooking the head of the table, which is occupied by a man-and-a-half tall oil portrait. From the painting, 7 figures eternally gazed upon the room. In the foreground, a child of the palest complexion and seaweed-green eyes sat on the floor with neatly folded hands. In the wake of this blonde ghost, 2 women were seated on carved lion chairs. The younger had high cheekbones, soft lips, and gentle blue eyes that drew the focus away from her wavy midnight hair. The elder shared the same high cheekbones and dark hair, though her eyes were a striking shade of emerald. Even in the painting, one could tell she demanded the utmost respect from others. Standing between the 2 women was a young lady of middling height and shapely curvature. Her chestnut ringlets were tied back so that they gently kissed her shoulders, and though there were shades of green in her eyes, browns and grays were also present. Directly behind her was a gentleman whose stance and expression were replete with pride. One could assume he received the same respect as his wife, although as a man he need not demand it. The young man to his left was his twin in appearance, sporting the same wavy hair that glowed like the embers of a Christmas fire, soft gray eyes hidden beneath a stern brow, and a tall, rigid frame. The sole difference were the slight advantage of height and larger nose of the elder. To the right was a strong, lean man, whose height exceeded the other 2. He had curly, wheat-colored hair, hazel eyes that matched the girl with chestnut locks. Thus the painting garnished the room, each feature beautiful, pristine, perfectly fixed for all to see, and so it would remain until time broke the very fabric of the canvas upon which the 7 lived. Aurora glanced into the dining room as she passed to see which dishware had been selected for the evening. They were her least favorite. Ugly pink things, trimmed in silver, with fuchsia flowers painted in the center. Priscilla's obsession and incessant whining must have become unbearable for Mother. After returning her book to the mahogany nightstand in her room, Aurora turned her steps towards the parlor. Resisting the temptation to slide down the banister like she had done as a child, she took the steps one at a time, humming to herself as she went. The rest of the family had probably already set to work patronizing poor Mr. Kensington. Her hand was almost on the doorknob when she heard a shrill cry. "The flowers should be pink!" It was going to be a long evening. Aurora took a deep breath and entered. Keep going, 10 minutes? I don't know how long it's been. Okay.
Are you
Stop me when it's been too long.
Okay, no.
Again?
I think our audience, Big Bear Connected, are really interested in this. You just draw such a beautiful picture, and I'd like to keep listening to it.
Thank you. Okay, I will keep going.